Good evening, everyone. I apologize that we're starting late. We had a technical difficulty with YouTube. Tonight, I'm happy to bring on the editor of 000 magazine, Peter Stout. And along with Peter, Dom Miliano is going to be speaking alongside him, and Bill Gilbert will be fielding questions for Dom to ask. We like it to be interactive and fun, so please type in all your questions in the chat room. And finally, if anyone misses any part of this presentation, an NGR will make it available on our website, Facebook page, and our YouTube channel. With that, Dom, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome. This is going to be fun. I know Pete a long time, and you're going to hear a lot of interesting things about something we all love, which is Porsches. So Pete, the first thing we'll do is I'll just ask you briefly. We all know why we got involved with Porsche, but what was your attraction? When did it start? And give us some insight into how crazy you are about stuff like cars.
Well, first, thanks for having me. And to your question, somebody asked that a long time ago, and I realized I was a car nut first. I just love cars, all kinds of cars, and I'm kind of a transportation junkie, and that anything that moves, I'm sort of interested. So that includes everything from planes and trains and blimps to, trucks. First, I wanted to be a truck driver. So basically, however, the first time Porsche kind of came on my radar was my best friend growing up next door. He had a Tommy pocket car of a silver 930, and we shared all of our cars except he would never share that one. So it kind of suggested to me at a very young age that Porsche was special. But where things really started was my older brother was looking at Triumphs and MGs. And when he was 16, 17 years old. And then I started to drive around with him in the hills of Berkeley. There's great driving roads. Most people think of Berkeley as this radical, crazy place, and it's all that, but it also is a phenomenal car culture. There's a lot of real car nuts and incredible car culture there. And there's also great roads above UC Berkeley, great curvy roads. So I fell in love with driving with my older brother in that car. And then ultimately my brother got into motorcycles and I got stuck with that car. It was broken down and needed a lot of work, but the deal was if I could pay to fix it and pay to insure it and fuel it, I could drive it. And that's where things started. So it started with the 914, a little bit like you.
Yeah, 914 it can be in this part of the world we have winters and stuff, can be a little bit of a problem, but you have weather to beat the I'd say you probably drove it for a while without the top on, right?
Here and there, yeah. 16, 17 years old, turned loose in your first car, it's freedom. And yeah, I definitely got I got sunburned more often than I probably should have in those years.
So how'd you get started writing about them and then photographing them and then eventually editing them? I mean, was it for access or just something had to happen? How'd you go from, like, because there's somebody watching this that likes to see their name in print. We all do, right? And they're going to write for their club magazine. Well, you did it at the highest level. So how did you start that? What was the inspiration?
Well, it started, I believe, with Twin Trunks Tribune, which was a little paper, saddle stitched, stapled, probably folded 8.5 by 11 paper. It was done by a bunch of 914 nuts. And so I wrote some articles for them. So I believe my first editor was Perry Keel out of Texas. And really neat guy, and that's kind of where things started. And then I approached excellence while I was in college. There's a long story in how I got into that, and I won't bore members with that here. But in college, I submitted my first article to Excellence magazine, and I must have printed it out on a college printer. I couldn't afford a printer in my room. This was back in the day when you started your Mac, and there was a little icon in the middle of a disk, and it had a question mark blinking until you put your disk in for the hard drive. And so I went up to the college print lab and must have printed that story 35 times before I sent it to Tom Toldrian, who you also know, of course. You were already a writer at Excellence, and I would read your work as a high school student in Berkeley, a little place called Dave's Smoke Shop. And so I submitted that story to Tom Toldrian, and I was terrified, which is probably why I printed it 35 times. And he published it almost the way it was submitted. So then I got a little cockier in my next story. I didn't print out 35 times, and he did a lot of editing on my second story. So that's how I got my start.
Okay. Well, when you get, I tell people that there's no money in this, in writing, but there is access, you know, so when you were at Excellence, there was Sports Car International, Corvette, Bimmer, Woodworking, and Excellence. Tell us about some of the really cool cars you've driven during that period. Crazy stuff.
Sort of 90s, I was there from 97 until 2012. So really the beginning of this new sort of second golden age of the automobile. If you subscribe to the idea that the first golden age was the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. I'm not sure I fully subscribe to that, but it was definitely a golden age, and it's been a golden age that's continued, as we all know. And so some incredible cars came through, particularly with Sports Car International and Forza, the Ferrari magazine. And so I was lucky and fortunate to test every new Porsche from 97 until 2012, which is probably of most interest to fellow PCA members. But then also some of the other cars would come, and for instance, Jackie Giray, the editor of Bimmer and Forza, who you know, one time was pulling a Ferrari 575M into the warehouse. And I said, well, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm tired of paying for the fuel in this thing. And
that sounds like her.
I said, could I take that home tonight? And she said, sure. And so the art director and I we used to carpool. We took it was a good commute. It was Marin to San Francisco. We both lived in downtown San Francisco. So it was reverse commute over the Golden Gate Bridge every day. And so we went home by way of Mount Tamalpais. And it was just glorious. That front engine V12 Ferrari, but there's been many others that probably too many to list. And I don't want to get into a laundry list of them, but yes, the access is pretty wild. And that is a big part of why I got into this business.
So now you've driven all of the cars. You sort of came in at the end of the air-cooled era, but you had to have driven everything cool prior to that as part of stories, right? So what's air-cooled? It's like ridiculously expensive and unlikely I'll ever own one. But with some of the cool air-cooled stuff you've driven that get everybody's juices jangling.
Well, you owned one. You had a 914.
And a 356.
And that's right, a 356 Irish green, right?
Oh, wow, that's a memory.
Yeah, that was a cool car.
Right. Thank you. That is a cool car. It's still around.
That was a cool car. I'd love to see a picture of it now. You know, when I started, the only air-cooled car I'd driven was my own 914, and then the first press car I got was my first and last air-cooled press car alone. It was a 993 Carrera S, although I drove a 993 turbo press car at the 95 Porsche parade in Portland, Oregon. With a very nervous Bob Carlson sitting next to me because I was an untrained 21-year-old with 400 horsepower, which now doesn't sound like that big a deal. 400 horsepower is not so wild, but back in 98, or I'm sorry, 95, 400 horsepower on a 911 must have been, especially in the hands of a 22-year-old. That must have been interesting for Bob. But I think since starting Excellence and then Panorama and then 000, I've been fortunate to drive a lot of things. And so I think, 73 RS, I raced a 51 356 at the last Rennsport reunion, which is the hardest I've ever worked to go that slow. I believe my top trap speed that I saw on the front straight was 68 miles per hour. And I had
51?
What's that?
That was a 51?
51 56. It was one of the two oldest cars on track for Rennsport reunion, and the other was 51 356 with Wayne Baker driving, and he was smoking me all weekend until Sunday, and we had a knockdown drag out. He had 44 horsepower and synchromesh, and I had 38
Yeah,
horsepower and no
a crash
synchro
box.
mesh.
You had a
But
crash
I had
box.
no interior, so I was a little lighter. And I got to watch him pass me on the way up to the corkscrew, and it was a thing of beauty. He started his pass back in turn 5 and got me at turn 6, and then I got him on the way back down the hill. We had a ball, and we were absolute moving chicanes for everybody else in that race. So, you know, it's been 916, one of 11, and as a fellow 914 guy, you know that's a, you know, you don't plan on driving that 914 6 GT. I raced a RSR 3-liter. I start to kind of think about this, and it turns into a laundry list, and it's basically the kid from El Cerrito who never thought he would get to drive any of these cars.
Yeah. Somebody just questions crash box. That's non-synchro mesh, if anybody didn't know what that meant.
Yep.
But that's non-synchro only in first, right? Or is it all the way through
No,
the
the whole
box?
box, and I got to tell you, it was humbling because
Yeah.
I was raised with mechanical sympathy, and I could grease the upshifts, but I had a bear of a time with the downshifts.
That's tough. So in that era though of the dawn of the water-cooled cars, a lot of people, you know, didn't realize that they had to get rid of the air cool because of all kinds of stuff, you know, on 2 valves per head and emissions and noise. So the air cooled cars, when they went away, the water cooled cars, you know, in my opinion, since I own one now, they're just better drivers. Do you agree or you disagree?
Better for what? I mean, you know, I've kept my old 914, the one I had in high school, and you know, I've got a modern water-cooled car too, and I love both. And I think if someone's able, to me, the best way to enjoy Porsche is to have one air-cooled or one early car and one later car, and I would rather have 2 just sort of normal, approachable cars, one from each camp, than one really expensive from either camp. And the reason I feel that way is one always makes me appreciate the other more. You know, when I had a 2.5-liter Boxster, when those were somewhat new, and my old 914, back then it was still a 4-cylinder, I would get in the 914 and drive over the bridge and go get the 914 out of storage, and I'd go drive and say, why do I want that 2,900-pound Boxster? This thing's wonderful, and it smells great, which means terrible, but comforting.
Yeah.
And it sounds terrible. Basically, 4-cylinder 914s almost never sound great. But the handling, the lightness, the simplicity. But then after a day in it, I'd park it and get back in the Boxster, and I'd say, oh man, I'm glad I'm back in this thing. So I like both for different reasons,
Yeah.
but maybe the most interesting nexus or the interesting crossing was the 993 press car, and then right after it, a 996.1 early car. Both guards red, oddly enough. And everyone was up in arms in those days about moving away from air cooling. And everyone was up in arms about the build quality and other things, and the shared front end with the Boxster and end of Porsche as we know it and all those things. And yes, I'll agree, 993, the interior quality, the materials quality, the your personal viewpoints, but I defy anyone to drive a 993 Carrera S and then a first-year 996 Carrera 2 coupe, both 6-speed manual, down the same back road and come back and tell me that the 996 wasn't a quantum leap. It was just a much, much, much better handling car. The shifter was better. There were just a lot of things. And that was the earliest 996 shifter. It would get better. But the 996 really was an important car. They were able to finally clean sheet all the learning. The 993, they wanted to do that, but they didn't have the budget. They couldn't get the board to let them do a new roof. And so they were stuck with a wheelbase that was very old. They were stuck with a lot of things. And the 996, they were able to finally say, here's 40 some odd years of learning with the 911, or 30 and change. And they could clean sheet it, and they could apply all the learning. So I like both, but you can't argue with the nostalgia of the air-cooled cars.
Now you've driven, talking about iconic cars, you've driven cars that people have heard about, read about. When I in '93, when I went out to Novato, my wife and I were going through Napa Valley, and a guy passed me in a 959, a real one, and I couldn't keep up with him in the Oldsmobile Buick. And so that became like my personal unicorn. Like I wanted to drive one. You've driven one. Tell people what it's like to drive a 959.
And this is where it sounds ridiculous, but I've driven, oh, I have to think about this. I've driven probably 7 or 8 of them. And
Wow.
the first time I drove one was at Sears Point, and there was just a little bit of time left. And I was mainly there to oversee the production of an article for Excellence. And so I didn't drive. Danny Sullivan and Kevin Buckler did the driving, and that was right because they were talented. But at the end of the day, there was a little time and I could choose one car to go out in. And there was a Ferrari F50 and a bunch of various 911 turbos. And I chose the 959. And there were 2 things that really stood out to me with that car. One was it was the best brake pedal I'd ever felt in a Porsche, and it's still one of the best brake pedals I've ever felt in a Porsche. Just fabulous brake pedal, which is a funny thing to say, but it's just really hard, but still you could still modulate it. I just liked it. It was very confidence inspiring. That car also had the power kit, and so from the carousel, turn 6 up to 7 at the end of the drag strip, that thing pulled like very few cars I've driven at that point. Remember, this is 2001 or so. 996 Turbo was also one of the cars there that day, and it was brand new. So, you know, but the suspension really underwhelmed me. The car was soft. You know, when I drove it, I thought, this is what I read about as a kid. This is this world-crushing supercar. It feels like it was tuned for luxury customers, and it was. The comfort was. And every comfort I've driven since is very soft. They drive a bit like they look. They're kind of high up, and they're soft. They're soft sprung because Porsche thought the customer at that price point wanted a luxury car. But then I drove a 959 Sport, and I was blown away. I've driven 2 of those, and they're everything you think a 959 is. They basically they ride beautifully for what they are, which is to say they ride really nicely. If you've driven a 993 Carrera RS, both the 959 Sport and the 993 Carrera RS handle and ride as though they were authored by the same hand. They're really linked. But the 959 has an extraordinary Group C derived engine. It's a very cool car, and the best seats of any Porsche I've sat in.
Yeah, that's one of those. If I was a gazillionaire, that would be one of the cars. The other one would be a 288, not an F40 or an F50.
288 GTO.
288 GTO.
Wait. There are 2 models near my desk, and one is the BBR 288 GTO, which is not supposed to be in this office, and then the other one is the Yellow Bird. So those are sort of my 2 from way back when.
Yeah.
I have not driven a 288 GTO, so that's a dream for me.
I'll call you and tell you about it. I drove
Okay.
one for Jack. I drove one for Jackie.
Oh, I'm jealous.
You get to see her, so Listen, tell us about the Yellowbird. That's got to be, if there's a video that everybody has seen, it's the tire smoking, thing. Go ahead, tell us.
Well, that's a funny story. It's a cover story for Excellence back in 2006, I think it is, 05 or 06. April 2005 or 2006 is the issue. And effectively, I, like everybody else, grew up and was just blown away by that car when it was in world's fastest car with road and track, 211 miles an hour. It subsequently did 213 miles an hour. And Alois Roof, who I got to know in the early 2000s, brought it out to California for the 50th anniversary of Porsche Club of America, and also so it was 05. And then also for a new 0 to 1 mile test with road and track. And he was here at a local PCA event here in the Bay Area, up in Napa or Sonoma. And he and Estonia were going to be staying in the city. And my wife, Rebecca, and I lived in downtown San Francisco. And they said, hey, let's meet for dinner. Do you know a good steakhouse? Typical European, like, let's eat steak. And so I said, well, the best one in the city is not far from our place. We'll meet you tonight. And so we went. And when the second bottle of wine was delivered, I said, Alois, everyone knows that the Yellowbird is the world's fastest car of its time and 211 miles per hour. we have this test loop that we use, and I've driven all the modern stuff and some of the great classics like 916 and RS27. And I said, but I've never really seen a story on what that car's like to drive. Everyone's seen the videos of Stefan Rosser going fully sideways with was it penny loafers and no socks or whatever he's got going on down there in a golf shirt, no helmet. And I've since met Rosser and he's amazing. But I said, hey, we all know that it's fast, but I've never seen something. How does it actually drive? Would it be possible to test this? And he lifts his glass. He says, this is a great idea. I will have the car delivered to you. And I couldn't believe it.
Did you buy a lottery ticket the next day?
I should have. So I picked the car up at Laguna Seca for the ALMS race. And it was the most surreal thing to drive that car out of Laguna Seca. This car that I had grown up reading about, seen in video games, all that stuff, and be driving it down a quiet highway in California, listening to the turbochargers go tss, tss. They let off alternately. When you let off the throttle, the wastegates sigh. And just when I thought it was, it's always right, left, it went left, right. And I ended up spending 3 months with that car, which is sort of surreal. But basically the rains came in that weekend and I called the handler and I said, hey, when do you need this back? It's raining here. And he said, how about before Christmas? So I drove about 2,500 miles in that car, rain, shine, on the loop, commuted, not every day. It was a terrible, it ran beautifully, it ran fine, but it was so dirty. They ran so much fuel to keep it cool that you had to hold your breath at intersections. And I'm not kidding. Like if you didn't hold your breath at red lights, you'd get sick. So it was an interesting car and it was on European plates and I'd have cops circle me in all 3 lanes, trying to figure out if I looked German enough or European enough to be driving that thing. I got a lot of suspicious looks and I finally did get pulled over once or twice and the guy was threatening to confiscate the car. That luckily didn't happen. But I think probably what most people are interested in is, I thought it was going to be this tell-all expose that it was going to be the Corvette of Porsche. I thought that the Roof CTR, the original Yellowbird, was going to be great on paper and awful to drive. Because how can it not be with 500 horsepower in a 2,600 and change pound car with 205 front tires? Think about that. A 211 mile an hour car with 205s on the front. You couldn't get the 215s anymore, the Demox, and 255 rears. So that's the same tire package as a 1999 Boxster, 1997 Boxster with the 17-inch wheels. That's, the same tire package. So I thought it's going to be a nightmare to drive with no power steering, no power anything except for the engine and torsion bars. And what I was shocked by was the car worked and you didn't have to drive it like Stefan Rosser. You could get into a rhythm with it, and it more or less responds the way an RS 2.7 does, because it's more or less the same mechanical grip and aero package. It's very similar. Envelope and general basic concept, torsion bars, 205 fronts, 255 rears. So you're instead of 185 and 215, but it's 500 horsepower. And what it turns out to be is the genius of those dampers and the whole setup, it just works. And it's confidence inspiring. And even mere mortals like the rest of us can go very quickly in that car. And I mean, very quickly down a great road. And I wouldn't let myself go on track in it. I just didn't trust myself because it was Alois Roof's special toy. But for me, the shocker was it was all the things we all love about an RS27, the mechanical feedback, the challenge of driving this early car well, but with the mental pace and mental challenge of a 997 GT2 or faster. And those are 2 different challenges. Are you going to drive an old car, an analog car quickly? That's a very visceral physical thing and you have no backup plans. But the modern cars present a different challenge, right? It's the speed creates a mental challenge where you have to be processing where you're going much more quickly. The Yellowbird is the only 911 I've ever driven that crosses those 2.
a question came up, and Bill, it flashed before I could read the whole thing. Can you ask Pete the question that just came in?
Sure. You mentioned Stefan Rosser, I think, if I'm saying the name correctly. You've no doubt ridden with some interesting pro drivers and some interesting cars. Tell us about a few of those.
Well, I think the standouts, I mean, obviously ridden with Hurley, David Murray, Johannes van Overbeek, Patrick Long. I mean, a bunch of these cats. Jörg Bergmeister, Wolf Hensler was one of the more interesting ones. Alternate lines at Sears Point, really impressive driver. But for me, probably the standout remains Walter Röhrl, and Miliano has stories there too. But for me, it was, I wonder if I can share screen or not. I went to the 918 prototype test in Leipzig, which is a very unusual case. They were terrified because they weren't selling. You might recall that they were very, very worried about whether or not they would sell all 918 918s for nearly $1 million. So they invited 24 journalists to Leipzig, and they had the test track for 1 day, which tells you how much in demand that test track was. Even Porsche's press department could only get 1 day. And we get there, and here's Chris Harris, who at the time used to write for, I think, Excellence, or had just stopped on his way towards Top Gear, and Meaden, who's a good cat. And there were just a lot of great people there and some skilled drivers. And we're sitting there in the press conference, and it's just raining. It's just raining outside. And you could just see all the PR handlers are in a permanent flinch because, usually they say, please be careful with the cars, but they didn't have to. We were all, even Chris looked a little nervous, and that guy's the drift king. And so we're all sitting there contemplating driving an 890, 900 horsepower prototype worth, they tell us, about $6 million on a track we don't know in the rain. At least that's my lot. I don't know. I've never been on the track. So we go out there, and I watch two 918s go by with big rooster tails. I mean, it's really coming down pretty well. And so I think, okay, you got a problem here. Here's your professional question. Do you go out? If you don't, do you let other people go out and maybe the track gets better, maybe the weather gets better, and maybe you have a better shot? Or do you go out before somebody wrecks the car? Because if someone wrecks the car, then you don't get to go out at all. So I watched them go by a couple times. I said, I'm going to wait until the weather gets better. If it gets better, I'll take my chances. And I decided to go out with Walter Röhrl. He's giving rides in a 997 GT3 RS 4.0, which Shannon knows a bit about and Matt knows a bit about. And so, I had spent time with, and I love those cars. And so Röhrl goes by on the way to their sort of corkscrew at Leipzig, which is not like the real corkscrew, but he goes up the hill sideways and right in front of me in this RS 4-liter. And I was like, yeah, I'll go out with Walter. So I go out with Walter because it's not even skill I look for anymore. It's temperament. And Walter is one of the coolest people I've ever met, certainly in the industry and just in general. And so we go out, and we don't go up the corkscrew. He goes the flat way to a hard right-hand turn. And then he goes to the next turn. It's a right-hand flat also, but kind of faster. And if you've been in the car with somebody, when they back it in to get it sideways, they kind of get off the throttle aggressively, or you can use a little handbrake and, or throttle kick and clutch kick and get the car sideways. Well, we go into this corner and the car goes full sideways, and he didn't do any of that. And so I look over at Walter, I'm like, there's not much grip, is there? And he goes, no traction. And I'm thinking, I'm about to get into a 900 horsepower 918. But I'll tell you, Walter is everything you think he is. And then on top of that, a truly decent human being. And also one who's well-spoken and honest in his feedback, much to occasional PR handlers' chagrin. He's really a good dude, and riding with him is a wondrous thing. I've only done it once or twice. Yeah, and 996 Turbo. I'll try to make this, 996 Carrera 4. I'll try to make this fast. I met him one night, and no one was paying attention to him. People were talking about their minivans, and I was 23 and terrified. It was my first European press trip. And so I looked over and I said, hey, do you still have your Austin Healey? And he looked at me like, how did you know that? But I knew it because of Excellence. And he said, yeah, I still have spikes in the back tires. And so we started talking. And the next day during the driving demonstration, I get in the 996 with him. He's going to demonstrate PSM, the very first car of PSM. And so we go tearing off towards this, or again, and he says, I believe driving begins when traction ends. And I'm thinking, that's the opposite of what I tend to think. And so he takes off for the hut, towards a hut about 60 miles an hour on gravel, and then PSM off, and then flips the car into a 360. And then he says, now we do it the other way. So I will do everything the same, but with PSM on. So he does the exact same exercise, and the car doesn't even spin at all. He does all the same movements, and the car keeps us perfectly straight. And then he says, if I change the steering wheel a quarter turn at the right moment during that maneuver, I can change it from 360 to 180. And you know that he's not talking about 181 or 179, but 180. The skill is freakish.
He's quoted as saying a real driver has bugs on the side window.
Yep. I guess I'm not a real driver yet.
Yeah, I don't know. I rode right seat with him up the Col de Turini, and he went around a hairpin with the tail hanging out without lifting. He just did it. You know, it's like, how did he do that? And we're going up, and the Col de Turini is really, really tall. So we drove into the clouds. And when we got to the clouds, he went faster. You couldn't see anything. I have to say, he is probably maybe the most memorable ride that I've had. So,
you know, you reminded me of one other that I'll quickly share, and that's Herbert Linge. I got a chance to ride with Herbert Linge in a Carrera Abarth years ago for the 60th anniversary of Porsche. Peter Falk too, in a 901, and that was Falk was interesting. He was elegant speed. Falk driver, and really it was like elegant speed with that little 2.6 liter behind us. But Linge was the standout for me, and what stood out was Royalist got mechanical sympathy. I always like riding with someone who's not hard on machinery. There's just something that I resonate with on that, when people are respectful of clutches and gearboxes and passengers and the road and all these things. And I've ridden with some incredibly people with incredible mechanical sympathy, but nobody like Herbert Linge. Herbert Linge was one of the earliest Porsche employees. He was a factory mechanic for all sorts of racing drivers for decades, and also a racing driver himself, and co-pilot Mille Miglia and so much else. And every shift in that Carrera Abarth was perfect. And it was as though you were riding with someone who had spent 50 years disassembling all the machinery that drivers have wrecked by their heavy hands and heavy feet. And so it was a neat thing to drive with a mechanic of decades of experience with the drivers he probably worked with, and a driver himself of no small repute. He was a wonderful driver. Linge is incredible.
well, you're friends. I know you're friends personally with Johannes van Overbeek and Patrick Long. I call him like a young gun. You know, and David Murray too. Although he's over 40, but he's still a heck of a driver. I've ridden with older guys, and I've ridden with younger guys, and there's a difference. And I don't know if you've noticed that. Like when you're in the car I had a half an hour with Garrett Bell and on the track. We shared my 914. Totally different experience with that and David Murray. And I just, if that's the same experience you've had.
Mine's a little different, and it's a matter of perspective. And I think it's important that everybody brings different perspectives. Like nobody's got the whole story. That's something we often say at 000, but we can journey. And so when I kind of think about what you're saying, I can see that being a perspective or a viewpoint. My own perspective is a little different in that I would say what I've noticed about drivers and instructors and people is temperament. And for me, it's temperament. And maybe aging has part to do with that. I mean, as a dad now, I evaluate certain risks differently than I did 10 years ago. So that's certainly part of it. And then as we grow older, we probably gain some different risk assessment, certainly from our teens and 20s. I think back to some of my stupidities. But on the other side of things, what I've noticed is temperament. And I'm not sure that it says it's directly connected to age. David Murray was for a long time my favorite instructor, and he was an instructor with me for about 10 years pretty regularly thanks to Bob Carlson. And I selected him for two reasons. One, I think he had the gift of teaching. All of those drivers are incredible drivers. All of those drivers are at a level I'll never attain, because most of my tens of thousands of hours are at a desk, like most people. So, they've got tens of thousands of hours driving. So you have to recognize that fundamental difference. But Murray drove the way I wanted to. What I've noticed is drivers have different styles. And one of the things I loved about Murray was he wasn't pitch and catch it and trying to, he was really clean. He'd go through a corner and it was this arc and he'd carve it. And I just loved the feeling of it from the passenger seat. So Murray and I, for about a decade, neat tracks. He was a fabulous instructor and teacher and just a good egg. I miss seeing Murray with regularity.
We have some questions about cars coming in. Somebody's asking what you think of the Carrera GT. I think you may have a story or two there, but let's start there.
Yeah, it's still, do you ever have an experience in life where you say, okay, whatever this is, it could be a concert, it could be dinner, it could be whatever it is, you say, I think I'm experiencing it. I don't know if anything's going to eclipse this afterwards. And you just have this gut feeling about it, whether it's subconscious or conscious. And that's how I felt when I drove that car, not in Großdollen in Berlin. When I drove it near Berlin the first time at the airstrip, I liked it a great deal, but it was super intimidating. And, by that point, I'd gotten up to speed pretty well. By that point, I'd spent 6 years in the business driving new cars all the time. And so you build a different kind of muscle memory. You get good at extracting a lot out of a car that you just got into. And by that point, Boxsters and 996s and 996 turbos made it pretty easy to do that. The Carrera GT is not that kind of car. The Carrera GT is not for novices. The packaging is big. The clutch isn't as bad. I don't agree that the clutch is as bad as everyone says, but you have to understand what's going on mechanically with that. But it was an intimidating car for me, whereas a Boxster or a 996 turbo or even a 996 GT3 really wasn't. And so Berlin, I loved it. The noises, the cool factor, all that. But a local magazine did a story on the Carrera GT where the owner named it Othello for its fatal flaw, the clutch. And this is because the owner had to replace the clutch at almost no miles, I think to the tune of $25,000. And so Carlson calls up and he says, I want to send you a Carrera GT and I want you to write whatever you're going to write about it, but I want you to spend time with it. And so the car shows up and I had a week in the car, and it wasn't a press car. No one got like a week in that thing. People would get a day or they'd have a handler or something. And it was really a testament to Carlson. And the point was to drive it daily. So I drove it in San Francisco. I drove it in the 3 and GT2 with us. And what I found with that car was it took about 200 miles for the intimidation factor to start to wear away, where I felt comfortable to start using the car. Now, granted, that was on tire technology of those days, and everyone with credibility said the same thing, that the car was ahead of its tires. Those were Pilot Sports, and the car was way ahead of its tires, and it's ahead of its traction control, actually. You could get wheel spin in second before traction control could rein it in. The engine just revved up so quick. And so that car, after about 200, 250 miles, I started feeling comfortable to use it to say, let's say 6, 7 tenths. And I don't really like going quicker than that on the road, unless maybe one corner you can kind of see everything. But even then, 9 tenths, 10 tenths, take it to the track. And so, but those cars at 5, 6, 7 tenths, you're starting to talk about serious pace. And I fell utterly in love with the car. I never had a scary moment in it, never had a problem. I don't buy into the whole myth and mystery around the Carrera GT somehow being problematic. Was it as resolved as some of Porsche's other cars in terms of handling? No, but is it absolutely spine tingling? Yes. The engine noise back in 04, 05 when I had that car was so good that you could just completely forgive Porsche for the Cayenne.
forgive Porsche for the
would say, yeah,
Cayenne.
this is better than them not going to the mall. Yeah, that this is, well, and back then, remember, none of us were excited about the Cayenne. You know, it's interesting to think back to the Cayenne now, but we don't probably want to talk about that tonight. That's a whole other show of its own. But making nothing sounds as good or better than the Judd V10, which was always the best ALMS car to listen to. So it just, you know, I had a sense that that was the best, that from a pleasure standpoint on the road, that was going to be the high bar. And it has remained the high bar. 15 years later, on the road anyway, I've never driven a more spine-tingling Porsche.
Somebody asked, have you driven the 904? And if so, which one?
No, I have not driven a 904. I've sat in one, and I can pretty much fold myself into anything I want to drive. And I struggle with that one. It was Jim Barrington said, "Oh, you got to sit in it," and I sat in it. It was in a warehouse in Oakland, and you know, the adjustable steering column. I'd like to drive one, but I have not.
Okay. One of the things that this is a personal question for me. Did you have, when you left Excellence and you went to Pano, did you go there with the idea you were going to take it away from the glove box size to a full size magazine? Because that was
No.
brilliant, in my opinion, anyway.
No, I was asked by the executive council to do a study on whether or not it should change sizes. So I did a study on that. I actually did it, oddly enough, in the office I'm sitting in, which I completely moved out of and then moved back into later because it was the best unit available. But I would have loved to have seen the cleaner's face when 2 months, 3 months later, it went back to pretty much the way it was. That study was done here, and it was done with 3 magazines, the original Panorama, Excellence, and Evo. I wanted to look at different sizings. And so they weren't selected so much for content. They were selected for the size of the physical package. And initially, when I just looked at there were 9 boxes effectively. The first stripe was Panorama, Excellence, Evo, just the covers. The next stripe was a double page opener, you know, Maximum Beauty, a stripe, Panorama, Excellence, Evo. And then the last stripe was Panorama open to the last page of an article with an ad across from it, and the others as well. And what I wanted to evaluate was, is it worth it? You know, do you really mess with 50 some odd years of, I think it was 57 years of tradition? Because you have to take that seriously. And so ultimately, the covers didn't sway me. I thought, it's not that different. But when you opened it, the size disparity doubled, and then it really mattered. But for me, the big sort of marker was, even as an editorial person, I care less about advertising than I do about editorial. I feel very strongly about separation of church and state in media. And I feel, as I looked at it, I thought, you know, if I'm an advertiser, I don't want a junior page ad. If I'm paying a full ad page rate, I want a real ad page. And I kind of noticed that after I noticed how much more text I could dump onto that closing page across from it. And so those were things I looked at. And then I found out that the club was paying for a full-size magazine that was then cut down to that smaller size. And so they were paying for all that paper, not to mention all that paper waste. And that bothered me at a core level. So my recommendation to the club was, you're already paying for the full-size magazine. Why cut down to this, first of all? And how many of your members are really putting these in the glove boxes of 356s anymore? So my recommendation was, I would probably change it, but it was not my decision. And I only came to that recommendation after being commissioned to do the study.
That's a really important historical perspective. I like that. Tell us about, where did 000 come from? I mean, it's philosophically, I've gone to your webpage, you know, I know you, but not everybody would know. Go ahead. Talk about 000, where it came from, and what's the vision and mission.
You know, I was approached by someone years ago who kind of said, okay, saw what you did at Excellence, saw what you did at Panorama. I'd love to see what you do with Blank Slate. And, you know, when I jumped from Excellence to Panorama, I kind of looked at that as probably a 10 or 20-year gig if the club would have me. And I kind of built everything in Panorama for 10 years. And at 2-3 years, it became clear to me that no, I was the right person to help them with the transition. I was the right editor to help Panorama in a transition. But you know, this challenge from somebody kind of started to stick with me. And I thought, well, what would I like to do? And what could a magazine look like? And what could be, is there something we can create that adds to the landscape, that doesn't compete with existing? I didn't want to compete with Excellence, and I didn't want to compete with Panorama. And so I didn't want to compete for ad dollars. And I wanted to do something as we grow older, we want to grow, right? We don't want to stop growing. So I wanted to do something more in depth, more artistic, more design oriented, and something that wasn't a good fit for those other business models, something that was really off the deep end. So 000 is effectively, I was asked at a restaurant once what this thing is, and the chef came out, actually. It was kind of fun. And he said, well, what is this thing? A restaurant called Foreign Cinema in San Francisco. And I hope they survive COVID, because if you're ever in San Francisco, you want to go to Foreign Cinema. It's an absolutely incredible restaurant. And so out he comes, and he's like, what is this thing you're working on? He was kind of a Porsche nut. And I said, it just hit me. I was like, well, it's sort of an art criticism piece that just happens to be about Porsche. So effectively, we approach Porsche as a subject of art, a nexus of design, engineering, motorsport history, culture, and we effectively disassemble the brand to really examine it. So we'll spend 24 pages on seats. We'll spend 24 pages on lightweight bucket seats and a full analysis, or we'll spend, we'll catalog all the other wheels from a certain year to a certain year besides Fuchs. And then we'll catalog Fuchs with all original finishes. And, my feeling as, and Alex's too, as a co-founder, we want to capture this stuff before it's gone. And what we do doesn't fit in a general interest magazine or even really a normal Porsche magazine. And it doesn't fit in a book. It's a bit like a magazine in that you don't know what you're going to get each month, but you know that it's going to be on a particular subject and it's going to examine that subject. And so that's what we do. It weighs about 3 pounds and there's only 5% ads. So there's 18 pages or ads out of 260 pages. It's designed to take you 2 or 3 months to get through it casually, to get you off of screens and to make time at home more enjoyable. Quiet time. And I think the world needs more quiet time. I do.
So we have another car question. Somebody wants to know what you think of the Taycan, and Porsche's whole bridge into the electric world.
Well, end of 2019 was an interesting year. I drove in fairly close proximity a Taycan Turbo S in Europe, and then a 917K at Sears Point in the rain. So it was kind of a wild end to last year. And what I would say is the Taycan, both of them surprised me in different ways, but the one that was the standout from what I expected was the Taycan. I like internal combustion engines. I like stick shifts. And I found myself utterly transformed. My perspective was shattered with the Taycan. Michael Harley is without question the best co-driver I've had on press launches. Dom knows something about this. Your co-driver can kill you or make your day a lot less enjoyable. And Michael Harley and I really go well together. And we're leaving the hotel and he gets on it. And I happen to be looking out the window and to the side, and he gets on it because you don't have to worry about cold oil. Like you leave the hotel, you leave the hotel in a 911, you got to make sure the oil's up to temperature. Not in the Taycan. So we're leaving and he just stomps on it. And I ended up with a kink in my neck that didn't go away for 5 days. And 2 other measures of just how fast that car is experientially. You can see the speed numbers with the tests, but experientially 2 things stood out. We didn't have a conversation about it, but we started warning each other whenever we were going to floor it. And what we would all both do is we'd both put our heads back against the seat backs. Even the driver would. Typically when you drive, you're ready for the acceleration. When I was driving the Taycan Turbo S, I would put my head against the headrest to avoid the neck strain before getting on it. And that's no exaggeration. That was actually going on in the car for those 2 days. The other was something I've been in some wildly fast cars, 1,500 horsepower, some nuts, truly nuts cars. It's the only car I can ever remember being in the passenger seat and my toes would come off the floorboard. My heels would stay down there, but my toes came off the floorboard whenever Michael would get on it hard enough at certain speeds. And so I've never, I can't really think of anything with the immediacy. Not even the 918 had the immediacy of speed in response to your input. The other thing I was very curious to see was how would it do with high speed, because if you're on the Autobahn, a normally aspirated car takes a long time to get up to speed if you get off. Whereas a turbo car likes that load, it likes fighting the air, and turbo cars are superior on the Autobahn. I was curious, how will an electric car be? And we hit 167 miles an hour indicated in the Taycan, and it pulls like a turbo car up there. It likes the load. So I was impressed. I've had some colleagues who are less impressed with the Taycan. I'm not as up to speed as they are on Tesla, but the handling is preternatural. You just have to remember it weighs a lot. It's heavy. But what I found most seductive, oddly enough, and I love the sound of a GT3, I love the sound of a Carrera GT. What I found most seductive was the quiet speed. You know, we did some launches for a video that went on Instagram, and you can find that on 000's feed. And it's just out in the countryside, and here came some bicyclists. I was like, oh boy, you know, here in Northern California, I don't know how they are elsewhere, but bicyclists, there's a whole thing with sports car drivers and bicyclists, and there's a lot of animus. And I thought, oh boy, they're gonna get mad. They didn't even care. And then I waited a while and accelerated to catch up because we wanted to get out of there. And the bicyclist didn't even turn around. I expected him to turn around and flip me off. And he didn't even turn around. He didn't even know I was coming. And so I kind of liked that. I kind of liked that there was, if we had been on that country road in the GT3 RS doing that, you know, people would have called the cops. And it was just, we could do these, you know, a bunch of acceleration runs for in the middle of nowhere for a camera, and we didn't bother anyone else. So the watershed moment came the next morning when I went back to the airport, and Dom knows about that, the 4 a.m. wake-up call to go back to the airport. And I get in a Eurovan TDI for the drive back to the airport. And the guy starts it, and anybody knows those knows they're quiet. TDIs are a quiet diesel. It sounded like a cacophony after the Taycan for a couple days. And since getting home to California, you know, I thought, boy, do I even need my 911? So I went and drove. I was like, no, I got to have a stick shift. I got to have a flat six. But I think I'm done with all the other internal combustion. If it's not an interesting internal combustion engine, I'm all done. Like, and now when Ford F-150s and Camry V6s and inline 4-cylinder Mazdas go by at the intersection, it sounds like noise pollution to me. So the Taycan really changed some perceptions for me. I couldn't replace my old Porsches with it. But as a daily, if I could afford that, I'd have to think pretty hard about it.
Hmm. What do you think about the Porsche getting involved with the Formula E? Is that sort of an indication of the whole future of automotive?
I have a tougher time with quiet race cars. I'm trying to reserve judgment and kind of hold out on that. I need to see it in person. I'm curious to see what it looks like in person, not on video. The 919, for those who saw a 919, the way one of those left, whatever turn it is, turn 1 or so, or turn 2 at COTA, blew my mind. You know, the 919, you can tell it's fast by the way it leaves corners. So I'd like to see that, but I think the fundamental problem of the Formula E, personally, this is just me speaking personally, is I don't think the cars look good. You know, the cars don't look good to me. So not only are they not making great noises and all the emotional appeal of that, we've seen that before with the Audi TDIs. This is at another level. Attractive. You know, they're not 917 Longtails. They're not 911 GT1s. They're not even RS Spiders for me. And they're not 80s Formula One cars. You know, 80s Formula One cars look gorgeous to me. And some later ones and some earlier ones. I wish Formula E was, if we're going to do that, I'd like them to be utterly gorgeous. And to me, they're so functional, and they're a bit speed racer. And that doesn't.
I watched when they had one in Brooklyn. I went to that race. They're fun to watch. They just don't sound like cars.
Yeah.
Sound like sewing machines.
Yeah, I haven't seen one in person yet, so I have to kind of reserve judgment. I'm curious what they're like to drive too. Of course, we can always get kind of sabotaged by the fun of driving something.
So
Well,
one perhaps last question, looking at the clock, question that came in is your favorite place to drive in the world? You get to drive all these nice cars and all these nice places. You know, do you have a favorite?
I did the Col de Torini in the snow and GT3 touring. That was fantastic, although harrowing because the roads are too narrow in places. The Pyrenees was an incredible place to test. I'm partial to the North Georgia mountains. They're fantastic. Parts of Tennessee. But to be honest with you, years and years ago, or not so many years ago, a few years ago, a German was like, "Oh, where are you from?" And I said, "You know, California." And he said, "Oh, the United States." He's like, "It's a pity for you. You have no good roads." And I thought, are you smoking a crack rock? Because basically, my favorite place to drive in the world is Northern California, far north of San Francisco. Everyone goes south and they think of PCH, but I like to go north. And you can spend 14 hours, the driving day of 14 hours, and never see a freeway and only see curves. And in Europe, when I go test around Weissach, I'll ask the Germans, "Oh, where's a good road?" And they'd say, "Oh, go here, this incredible road. It's 7 corners before you're in somebody's town again, and you can't speed through town." Whereas where I tend to drive, you go 33 miles and there's nothing. Maybe a few driveways that you have to be respectful about, but there's just nothing out there and there's very little traffic. And so you're not talking about 7 corners, you're talking about hundreds of corners. So for me, I tend to like Northern California, but I'm from here. There's a lot of other places with great roads.
All right. Well, you want to tell any last war stories, or we're going to say thank you if you're going to run back to making money?
Well, that's up to you guys.
Bill, anybody else have questions coming in?
We had one question about your Halo Porsche.
Define halo. And I know that the question asker might not be able to do that, but we'll try to. What would you guys say halo is?
Probably the one that best exemplifies the mark. It would be my answer. I don't know what the questioner had in mind.
Dom, do you want to weigh in before I answer?
I can tell you that that's a good, I would say it's the one that leaves the most impression on you. That for me, you get out of it and you go, can I get back in? Or it's like ice cream. I had gelato in Florence. I can't wait to get back to it. That's my Halo ice cream. So that's the kind of car.
I've had great drives and everything from Boxster 2.5s, which I happen to love, and 914s to all sorts of GT3s. I mean, all over the place. But I'd say there's sort of a few that get into and I'll give you a finalist because I hate the non-answer. But so I won't leave you with a non-answer. But the finalists for me would probably be in the range of 997 RS 4-liter, Carrera GT, 987.2 Boxster Spider, 917K, and I happen to be very partial to 996.2 GT3s as well, having now driven the other 996 era GT3s. But for me, the finalist, it's either the Carrera GT or the 917K, and for very different reasons. But they're both such exquisite cars, and we should, if it's going to be a halo, it should be we have to throw the roof CTR or the Yellowbird in there as well. But if you're going to talk about halo, it's the thing that you reach for, right? The thing that keeps you dreaming. And for me, the cars that keep me dreaming and that blew my mind as an experience driving wise, just the whole experience of being around Carrera GT and 917K. Personally, those are high points with honorable mentions to Roof CTR, RS 4-liter, the original, and then the Boxster Spider.
Okay. Well, and if nobody else has questions, Pete, I would say this is like old times. It's a great afternoon and evening for me. So I'm glad we got to do this.
Likewise, it's been a lot of fun. It's always fun to talk cars and talk trajectory a little bit. I hope it's been fun for your members.
I've had a great time. Thank you, Pete. I apologize that we had some technical difficulties getting onto YouTube. We did stream this obviously from our Facebook page, and we'll be working on how to get this up to our YouTube channel. But I want to thank you for your time. I really hope I get to get out to California and see some of those fun roads to drive on. And just want to let everyone know, next week we're having the History of the Glen with representatives from the International Motor Racing Research Center. So I hope you can join us for that. But again, Pete, thanks. I've really enjoyed getting to know you, and it was a fun night.
Thank you all, and I'll look forward to seeing you down the road.
All right.
Say hi to Rebecca.